Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm feeling a little bit left out without a glass of something nice but then I'm not the main attraction here, so it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all back to the last session of the evening. I'm thrilled to have with us Robert Harris, author of 8 best-selling novels, including Fatherland, as you will know, Enigma, Archangel, Pompeii, Lustrum, and The Fear Index, several of which have been filmed, including most recently The Ghost, directed by Roman Polanski. Robert's latest novel, An Officer and a Spy, is an absolutely gripping, factual retelling of the Dreyfus Affair. In his own words, perhaps the greatest political scandal and miscarriage of justice in history. Writing in The Observer, Andrew Anthony praised An Officer and a Spy as a compelling narrative of state corruption and individual principle. With us to discuss the affair is multi-award-winning biographer Hilary Spurling, best known, I'm sure, to you all as the biographer of Henri Matisse, winner of the 2005 Whitbread Prize for Matisse the Master, The Conquest of Colour. Hilary's knowledge of Matisse and his circle give her the perfect insight into how the Dreyfus Affair split artistic France, as indeed it did the rest of French society. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Robert and Hilary to Charleston.
Well, I don't think you need me to tell you anything about Robert Harris, who is, as we all know, one of the most brilliant and strangest, as well as one of the most enjoyable writers alive today. One of the most extraordinary things about him, many of them I think, but one of them, is simply the way he swoops from the Roman world of Pliny and Cicero to Germany in the 1960s, still a totalitarian state, with hideous, murderous, monstrous underlife about which nobody knows anything, because this, of course, is if Hitler had won the war. Robert Harris knows everything there is to know about that, just as he does about contemporary Russia, about code breakers at Bletchley in the Second World War. And very, well, one of his most extraordinary books, I think, is indeed The Ghost, a book about a ghostwriter writing the life of Tony Blair by the man who would almost certainly have been asked to ghost the life of Tony Blair if such had happened. And strangest of all is the latest book, Officer and a Spy. I mean, who would have thought anyone could take the hoariest and best-known whodunit of history and turn it into a thriller of such mystery and suspense that you cannot put it down? I know quite a bit about great French scandals because I wrote a book about Matisse, whose life was smashed and ripped apart by the next great French scandal after Dreyfus, the Humbert Affair. And so I can vouch for the fact that everything in this book seems to me completely accurate, from the stench of sewage in the streets to the concerts at the Salle Harcourt, which were the modern era's first modern concerts, really, attended by Colonel Pekar, but also by Henri Matisse. What I do not begin to understand is how Robert Harris could have done this, and that is what I hope we're going to discover tonight. So would you just start by explaining to us how you done it?
Well, thank you. That's a very kind introduction. I'm sorry I look so fluorescently red on this screen.
Oh, my Lord.
I can assure you it's not alcoholism, but merely the local sunshine. If you'd told me a couple of years ago that I'd write a novel about the Dreyfus Affair, Hilary, I would have thought you were crazy. It certainly wasn't something I intended to do. As you say, I made a film with Roman Polanski called The Ghost, and he wanted to make another film together. He invited me over to Paris, asked me if I had an idea for a thriller we could make together. I did. We agreed to make it. We kind of shook hands on the deal. We went out to lunch, and I happened to say over lunch, I saw you had a lot of books on the Dreyfus Affair in your office. Have you ever thought about making a film about it? He said, I've always wanted to make a film about the Dreyfus Affair. And by the time I got back to England, the idea of the thriller had gone out of the window, and he wanted me to look at writing a screenplay about the Dreyfus Affair. So I started reading up on it with a very heavy heart. I didn't know much about the Dreyfus Affair, except that it had gone on for 12 years and embraced a cast of hundreds, and I didn't think there could possibly be a 2-hour film in it. And then I came across Colonel Pekar, and I realised that there was at the heart of the Dreyfus Affair a kind of black jewel of an espionage story, very similar to a John le Carré story, in fact, quite similar to Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, about bureaucracy and paperwork. And I found it captivating, and I found the Pekar particularly interesting. He was a great intellectual. He spoke 6 languages. He was the youngest colonel in the French army. He was a high flyer. He was very artistic. He regularly attended the Bayreuth Festival. He had corresponded with Dostoevsky in his youth, and he became a great friend of Gustav Mahler. He was a very unlikely soldier in a way, and he was even more unlikely man to unravel the Dreyfus mystery. And the more I read, the more fascinated I became. And eventually I went back to Polanski and said, listen, I want to write this as a novel, actually, not as a screenplay. And he, to his credit and my good fortune, said, do it as a novel first. I always think it's better to make a movie from a novel. You get more depth of character and story and detail. So do that first, which is what I did. And that is how I came to write it, not something I ever would have expected to do. But probably the book I've most enjoyed writing, in fact, curiously. And it was a great thrill to do it. And now, hopefully, we'll do the film at long last.
And took you, I believe, I understand, 6 months to write. I can just about understand that, because if writing under great pressure, as journalists, and obviously you had a journalistic training, that is possible, and that does give a tremendous élan to any book. But what I don't understand is it seemed to have taken you about a year to do the research.
Probably not even that, I'm ashamed to say. I'm not. One of the reasons I'm fond of the book is I don't know quite where it came from or how it happened, and that is a rare thing, I think, for a writer. You probably agree. Most books you labour at, and eventually you get to something approaching what you'd hoped to write. That's been the pattern for most of my books. With this one, it seemed to just sort of come out of nowhere and take on a life of its own, and each day writing it was a pleasure, a kind of journey of exploration. And I'm not quite sure how it happened, to be perfectly honest with you. It made me do things I'd never done before. I read Proust, which I'd never done before, which is very useful for, obviously, colour and background in Paris at that time. I got hold of a Baedeker Guide to Paris, published in 1900 for the World Exposition, which gave me all the restaurants and the streets and the the way the taxis worked, and the way all clocks in French railway stations were set 5 minutes fast. You probably knew that, but so everyone caught their train. Lots of it's those tiny little details. Everyone who sat down in a restaurant in Paris at that time was given a bottle of red wine by their place. It was serious drinking. So all these tiny little details I pulled together, and then I made a point of reading everything I could about the affair. I don't speak French very well at all, but I can read it. So I read all the newspapers and the court transcripts, and then I just took a leap into the dark and started writing. I made 2 important technical decisions early on. One was I wanted to avoid a costume drama, and therefore I wanted to narrow the focus and just concentrate on Pekar. And I decided to tell the whole story in his voice, and that sort of elevated the story. That made it different, fresh. I had the idea that maybe Pekar could have kept a memoir of what had happened and written a memoir immediately after the main events, and then put it in a bank vault not to be opened for 100 years after his death. That made me think that he could write very freely about his love affairs and his opinions of his superiors and so on. And January this year was the centenary of Pekar's death, as it happens. And I also decided to start with this terrible scene of the degradation of Dreyfus as a sort of big public event, the public killing, if you like, and then Pekar begins to unravel what lay behind it, and that gave it a sort of structure that made it more readable, I thought, more interesting for us to go into the affair. We see in the first 10 pages the famous, terrible treatment of Dreyfus, and then with Pekar we start to realise and understand how this has come about. So those were the reasons that I approached it as I did. And I started it on January the 15th and finished it on July the 15th last year.
Well, I must say, I take my hat off to that. But as a biographer, I'm not really surprised you don't know where it came from. I mean, that would be for your biographer to explain, and I would start... this is just an aside, this is not what we're here to talk about. But if I was to do that, I'd start by examining Colonel Pekar, who obviously meant a great deal to you. Yeah. I would... I'd set the records such as they are, and I didn't even know they existed. I mean, he's just a name in all other accounts I've ever read of the Dreyfus Affair. I'd set what's known of his life, besides what could be found out about your life, and I think some very interesting conclusions might accrue. That's my experience. But it would be a very slow process. That's why I'm so fascinated by your incredible speed.
Well, it was odd. It was strange to me, to be perfectly honest, but it was like a gift. I mean, I felt I just wandered into the most wonderful treasure house, really, and all I needed to do was show people around it. Perhaps, I don't know whether it'd be useful to just briefly say who Colonel Pekar was and what he did. Pekar was born in the 1850s, I think 1854, in Alsace, in Strasbourg, then part of France, and quite a well-off family, Catholic family. His father died when he was 11. When he was 16, there was the war between Germany and France. He was in Strasbourg at the age of 16 when it was heavily shelled by the Germans, the first long-range bombardment of a civilian town and using modern weaponry. A great deal of devastation. Pekar survived all that. Famously, the French lost the war, 165,000 casualties, and under the peace agreement they had to withdraw from Alsace and Lorraine, and French people there had to decide whether they wished to be French citizens or German. Pekar chose, and his family chose to be French, and they moved to Versailles. They had to leave behind all their property. They were quite impoverished. His mother was a widow, and Pekar, who had hoped to be a musician or a surgeon, instead went to the military academy, and to everyone's surprise, probably including his own, he rose very rapidly. He was a very good soldier. He graduated 5th, I think, out of a class of over 300, and fought in Algeria and fought in Vietnam, and was clearly marked out as a high flyer. He was patriotic, super patriotic, highly intellectual. He ran across Alfred Dreyfus. Dreyfus was an artillery captain, also from Alsace, who had also come after the war to Paris with his family. But the bulk of his family remained behind in Mulhouse to run the family's textile factory. And as a result, Dreyfus was in a slightly uneasy position, I suppose, in that he had a huge private income, at least 10 times his army pay, from the wealthy family who were now German citizens. Dreyfus, though, also was highly patriotic, and he ran across Pekar in the École Supérieure de Guerre, where Pekar was a tutor and taught him topography. I don't think they liked one another very much, almost from the start. Pekar, and this is the curious thing about this book, was anti-Semitic. Mildly so, let us say, in the conventional, fashionable way in France and indeed in England at that time. Pekar was moved from the École Supérieure de Guerre to the French General Staff, and his job there was to supervise the program under which the highest ranking cadets from the military school were given a program to work in each of the 4 departments of the General Staff, 6 months in each. It's called the stagiaire system. I think they took about 18 or so a year. Dreyfus passed out high enough to go into this system. He was the only Jewish officer on the General Staff. and this coincided with a great period of upsurge in anti-Semitism in France, which had not previously been a phenomenon there, probably to do with the defeat in 1870 and the search for scapegoats, what's gone wrong with French manhood, why did we lose this war? After about 18 months after Dreyfus had been in the General Staff, they discovered that there was a traitor supplying information to the Germans. They discovered this because they had this amazing spy, probably the greatest spy in Europe at that time, who was the cleaning lady in the German embassy. It's a great warning, among many things, to the Dreyfus Affair about trusting your cleaning lady. She cleaned the office of Colonel Schwarzkoppen, the military attaché, who was having two affairs, one with the wife of the Dutch ambassador and one with the Italian military attaché, Major Panazzardi. And he would tear up his private papers, put them in the waste bin. Madame Bastien would take the waste bin, instead of taking it to the furnace, would take it to a man called Major Henri of the French Statistical Section, which was the cover name for a very small intelligence unit. There, the hapless Schwarzkoppen's letters would all be pieced back together, giving a great deal of pleasure to the French officers. Some of his letters, love letters to his dear chérie, Hermance de Vade, and also dear bugger number one letters to Panazzardi. One of the things that she retrieved from his wastepaper basket was the famous bordereau, which was a list of 4 or 5 documents that had been handed over, clearly, to Schwarzkoppen by an unnamed French officer. He didn't sign his name. And it was this that the French military recovered among all this love letters, and this set them on the track of who this spy could be. And they decided it must be someone in the French General Staff. He was clearly had access to at least the 4 departments. And who could it be? Well, who stuck out like a sore thumb? The only Jew on the General Staff who even spoke with a slight German accent, who had a private income 10 times his army pay. When his handwriting seemed to match, they decided to arrest him. And here Pekar re-enters the story again, because they decided that because he was Jewish, what they called upper Jewdom would try and arrange his release if it became known that he had been arrested. So they tricked Dreyfus into coming into the Ministry of War in civilian clothes. Pekar met him and conducted him to an office where he was arrested. And subsequently, he was given a secret court-martial. Secret evidence was passed to the judges. Pekar was involved in handing this evidence to the judges because he was sent as an observer of Dreyfus's court-martial. And Dreyfus was duly found guilty. On the same night that Debussy's L'après-midi d'un faune was premiered in the Salle d'Arcourt, as you say, and Pekar, in my novel, goes to, the moment poor Dreyfus is found guilty, he immediately hops in a cab and goes to watch the concert. And then Pekar was sent to witness this terrible scene of degradation which Dreyfus was put through in front of a crowd of 20,000. He had all his insignia of rank torn from him in front of a screaming mob, 4,000 soldiers also present. And then he was sent for life to Devil's Island, where the guards were forbidden to speak to him. He couldn't even say, when is my mail coming, or anything. And indeed, after 4 years, he found great difficulty in speaking when he was returned to France. Pekar, and this is really where my story starts, and I won't go through the whole of it, but just to set the scene, Pekar was then put in charge, astonishingly, of the statistical section. He was made Major Henri's superior. He took charge of the whole espionage network, including the things coming from the German embassy. And about 9 months after he'd taken over, Madame Bastien delivered another consignment of torn-up papers, one of which was torn into 40 pieces of postcard-size pneumatic telegram form. You could, in those days, rather like department stores here, the old days, they had pneumatic tubes running under Paris, and you could send a message from one side of Paris to the other, and you prepaid on a blue form, so they were called petit bleu. And this was from Schwarzkoppen to whoever was his agent. And it was clear that there was still a German agent operating in France. And Pekar started an investigation, and eventually he realized that the man to whom this petit bleu was addressed, Esterhazy, Major Esterhazy, was the spy, and Dreyfus was innocent. And then began the process of trying to find out why Dreyfus had been sent on such flimsy evidence. And that really is the book. And all of this is true. And as I came across the story and researched it more, you can see it's an absolutely natural detective story. It's completely perfect. There was almost nothing in the novel is invented, apart from obviously private life and so on, the public events, the things that Pekar actually did. And every single character in the novel existed. There's nothing in that sense invented at all. This is why my wife says I could write the novel so quickly, because she'd rather, having started writing novels herself, she's resentful that I didn't have to make anything up.
But on the contrary,
so that's how it was done.
I think that's where imagination comes in. I mean, the story you tell is so strange, so extraordinary. It is actually, as you just said, completely real in every front. But we, all of us, spend a lot of our lives covering over to ourselves, concealing from ourselves the extreme strangeness of ordinary life, the weird behaviour of ordinary people. We conventionalise it, we blandify it, we don't notice it, we didn't see that, we don't understand the implications of the other. And real writer, I mean, yes, of course, you did a great deal of research at staggering speed, but nonetheless, it is imagination. It's that kind of power, that focus that made you see. What we all now see is the most staggering story, and it's been lying around there that anyone could have picked up, like picking up a pebble from the beach. And shiny and wonderful it looks when it's wet, and then it dries out. It's just an ordinary old pebble, which is what most people's lives become, until you look at them in this extraordinary way. And I wanted to ask you, because after all, it seems to me that in every novel you've written, there is a kind of slow-burning secret that is revealed or reveals itself. I mean, Vesuvius did erupt, Dreyfus was framed, and the same would be true of every book. Of course, this is the kind of thing a high-powered journalist deals with in daily life. Can you say a little bit about that transition from, because I think that what makes great, or the gifts that make a great journalist, the ability to, punch hard and where people aren't expecting to be punched, and that kind of pressure under fire, and the ability to clarify and summarize very succinctly. All of those go into your novels, and I'm sure that great journalists have a lot of imagination too. So when you made that transition, just why?
Well, I made the transition a long 25 years ago almost. I wrote a book about the Hitler Diaries affair called Selling Hitler, which was eventually turned into a television series, gloriously, with Barry Humphries playing Rupert Murdoch and Alan Bennett playing Hugh Trevor Roper. And it gave me really a taste for drama. And I thought I'd write a non-fiction book about what would happen if Hitler had won the war, using all the plans and documents and so on. I'd read Hitler's Table Talk when I was writing Selling Hitler. And I sat down to write this, and I thought I had a clever idea. I thought I'd write it as if that world had actually existed. So I'd write a kind of guidebook, using the maps, using the photographs and so forth that existed. And I worked for a little while, and then I realized it was a lifeless world with no people, and that I had to invent people. And then I had to invent a story. And I was intrigued with this idea that Hitler wanted 20 or 100 million settlers in the Eastern Territories. Would they have stayed there? Would it all have worked? Or would it have fallen apart like the Soviet Union was doing just as I was writing? And above all, what would Hitler have said about the Holocaust? Or what would the Nazis have said, assuming that they weren't able to defeat America and the world would have settled down into a kind of superpower rivalry, rather as it did? And so I had to start writing a story, and I walked through the looking glass from non-fiction into fiction, and I've never returned, because I found on the other side so much pleasure in invention, so much to use the tools of a novelist to get at the truth and reality, which really is, to that extent, An Officer and a Spy is the apotheosis of everything I've tried to do as a writer. And so, it was a marvelously liberating feeling. I remember the first page of fiction I ever wrote is the first page of Fatherland, and I actually had to go and lie down after 2 paragraphs. I couldn't believe it. It could be raining, people could appear, and I could just make it all up. It was absolutely marvelous, and I've gone on doing that ever since. And I think that the great thing journalism gave me was, first of all, I think, an ability to kind of be willing to do research, ask questions, go and see things, find things out. And secondly, a love of deadlines. And really, I can't write unless I'm frightened. I mean, unless each day I have to produce 1,000 words.
And who frightens you now?
Well, I still get frightened because I've still got mouths to feed and bills to pay, and I make a point of spending money as rapidly as possible. Arnold Bennett, I think, used to buy a new yacht every time he finished a novel in order to force him to write another one. Thought of Alan Bennett buying a yacht, it's quite amusing. But Arnold Bennett certainly did. And so that's been my principle, and I justify it to myself because great novelists like Thackeray, Dickens, Trollope, wrote before a kind of self-consciousness about the novel. They wrote part works for Blackwood magazine, Collier's, Household Hints, all those magazines, and they had to get it done. And I take the view, if it's good enough for Dickens and Trollope, then it's probably good enough for me. And it removes a certain precious element from writing.
But you don't put your books out in parts.
Well, I do in a way, because each time I finish a couple of chapters, they have to go off and be translated. So, in a way, I can't look back that much. I can revise it a bit, but not too much. And so my method, one of the reasons why I could write this book so quickly, was that I know more or less what I'm going to do before I start. Not completely, but more or less. I've learned that a novel is a description of something that's already happened, and therefore you don't make it up as you go along to that extent. You make up how you might tell the story, but you don't actually make up the things that happen because you already know them. You don't make them up as you're going along. So in that sense, if I can get the opening right, if I can get the opening page right, then I think I can write the book, because everything is in that opening page. It's rather like if you're doing a search on Google, you put in the first letter or two, and there's an infinite world of possibilities. You put in the word, it narrows down. You put in 2 or 3 words, and suddenly all the possibilities shrink completely. So it is with writing a novel. The moment you've written the first sentence, so much is in the first sentence that is said.
I would have thought that's the same with writing any book and with
Exactly.
painting any picture.
Yes.
It's where you put your brush first.
Where you
I mean,
start.
that is what... And if you don't get that right, then you have to scrub it in the end.
Yes, so I wouldn't commit to deliver a book unless I'd at least written the first page.
Just to ask you a slightly crude question, the French, as you know, have this amazing and fearful moral law, which means that they don't just have copyright the way we do, but they also have a moral right and a moral control. That is to say, grandparents can completely control. They could, if they cared to go to law, exactly what anybody says about their grandparent.
Yes.
Have you had problems with the Pekar family? Are there Pekar descendants?
Well,
This is pure curiosity.
No, it's a very good question. You're the first person who's asked me something that has occurred to me, I can tell you. One of the reasons Pekar was, for a time, one of the most famous men in the world. He was the Edward Snowden of his day, as you were, the whistleblower of all whistleblowers, and not only that, the head of the organisation he was whistleblowing on. So he was he was very famous all over the world. He died, as I say, in 1914. He had a succession of affairs with married women, but he never married himself. He had no children, and he died a few months before the outbreak of the First World War. And because he was anti-Semitic and a lot of the people around Dreyfus didn't like him very much, he sort of vanished from history. I would hope to God, if there are any Pekar descendants, which there may be, they would be on their knees in gratitude for having resurrected their ancestor.
Should be. So they
but
will be.
There are
hero,
others who are One of the most telling things in the book is just a tiny footnote, because one of the authors of poor Dreyfus's misfortune was a man called Colonel Pekar Was, who was a sort of monocled fool who really tortured Dreyfus. I mean, had him imprisoned without access to any lawyer, family member, and used to wake him up at midnight to question him, and appalling behaviour. Pekar is investigated by my hero, Pekar, who goes to see him in his apartment to say, you know, what on earth what's been going on? And he notices a photograph in Pekar apartment of a newborn baby. And indeed, Pekar, his second wife, had just had a baby. And I couldn't resist the footnote, the baby. Charles Pekar, subsequently head of Jewish affairs under Vichy. And there is an extraordinary way in which these characters go on. You know, the Dreyfus family, Dreyfus's granddaughter died in Auschwitz. And several of the old Dreyfusards were hunted down by the Germans and murdered in the 1940s. And some of them continued to be anti-Semitic all the way through. Now, whether there'll be trouble from some of these people, I don't know. I hope my publisher has got good lawyers. We'll discover. The book comes out in France in the first week of June. The French Defense Ministry, to my surprise, have given permission for a launch reception in the Hôtel de Brienne, which is the opening scene of the book and the closing scene, which was the official residence of the Minister of War, where some of the action takes place. So,
I'm not surprised, because Pekar, your hero, is a great hero, and he represents everything that the French military must be proudest of. And the people that dug in their heels and fought him every inch of the way and had a great deal of success at the time, you know, their names are hardly remembered. So I'm not really surprised about that.
no, you may be right. Well, we'll see. I'm full of trepidation.
I'm not sure the
publishing
truth is
publishing a 600-page novel about the Dreyfus Affair when you can't give a speech in French. We
Just
all
as
know
well, probably.
what that could be like. I felt I should say that my French was rather like Churchill's, whose broadcast in the summer of 1940 began Français, c'est moi, Churchill. And also there's a famous account of him in Lascelles' Diaries, of him meeting de Gaulle, and the furious argument they had being overheard, with Churchill saying, let me get this right, vous me double-crossez, vous je le quitterai. Anyway, roughly on this level is my friend.
Got the gist, I should think. Can I ask you a very nosy question, which I've wanted to know the answer to for a long time? When you write a book at this amazing speed and it's finalised, as you say, there's no revision or anything like that, how does your routine go? How many hours? I mean, are you working 6, 12, 20 hours a day? How would that play out?
Well, I normally write from early in the morning, and when it's like this time of year, I would probably start at 5 or 5:30 in the morning, and would finish. I always finish at lunchtime. Stop at lunchtime, have lunch with a friend, and walk the dog and pick the children up from school or whatever. Try not to think about the book. Get to bed early. The next morning, the first thing I do is look over what I've written the previous day, correct it, and then hopefully go on. And I know if I'm going to have a good day by 10 o'clock, because half the work should be done by then. It's just the way my metabolism works. I used to write newspaper columns for the Sunday Times, the Daily Telegraph, and I would always then get up at 6 and finish it by 12. And there would be a space waiting in the paper, you know, for it. You couldn't say, oh, I've not got an idea today. Or, I mean, I did try it once or twice, but the only person who ever got away with that was Boris Johnson, I think. But I'm a believer in adrenaline. I believe that you see more in a time of crisis and tension, pressure. Your brain speeds up a bit and you get more ideas, and really inspiration is just a smart word for ideas. I've also become aware as the years have gone on how much of writing is done in the subconscious. I'm sure this is the case in non-fiction also, that problems resolve themselves and you wake up and you find that quite a lot of what has been worrying you has been sorted out in your head. So That's the rhythm, and I try and finish a book in 6 or 7 months in that way, but I would spend a year or so thinking about it. I'm supposed to be writing a novel about Cicero at the moment, but I know until September or October, until the fear kicks in, I can't really do it. So I come to charming events such as this and drink and be merry. And I know sensibly, of course, I should be really hard at it. I hope no one from my publisher is here, because they think I am hard at it. I know I should be, but I can't until the sort of.
You mean their
fear.
Deadline is set, and you're going to meet it?
The deadline is set for a book to come out in September, October next year.
But it's no point starting
known
now.
As Cicero 3, and I will hopefully write it.
Yeah.
Or if I don't, the world will still turn.
One other thing I wanted to ask, you've made some quite rude remarks about literature and literary writers and the airs they put on and the...
Not here, I wouldn't say
no.
that.
But I think this latest book of yours is the bookiest of all. I mean, you're a person who had Pliny ghostwriting one of your books, and very successful that was. But I then did have a look at the letters of the younger Pliny, and, you know, it's a very, very... I don't underestimate the imagination that went into that book. I think it's extraordinary. But, you know, you do have a great writer contributing there. Zola is actually a character, quite a powerful one in the current book. Your hero, as you say, is actually translating Dostoevsky in prison. That wonderful sentence you quote. Maybe a good thing or a bad thing, but it is such a pleasure to kick things to pieces every so often. Very Dostoevsky. And Proust sends him all his latest writings while he's in prison. So would you like to revise or qualify slightly your view of the literary...
No, I have enormous respect for the literary world, and I read English was my degree, not history. There's a certain... I believe that fundamentally, I suppose, that novels are an act of communication primarily designed to entertain. And if I can't write an entertaining page, then frankly I have no desire to write a page at all. Cicero says in one of the novels, again, which he actually said, oratory that does not startle, I do not consider oratory, which may surprise some who've struggled through translating Cicero, but still. I believe in entertainment, and I believe that there's no reason why a good book with a lot of ideas and literary characters and so on should not be entertaining and should not reach a large audience. And I dislike the preciousness of a literary world that sort of regards a large audience as somehow vulgar or a compromise. I dislike the Booker Prize for this reason, because I think it's done a lot of damage to English literature. It's hived off a kind of set of writing, which really should be more in the mainstream, in my view. And the economics of English literature these days is such that it's like the lottery. If you can win the Booker Prize, and you'll win the lottery. And I think that it's sucked a lot of oxygen out of the air as a result, and led to this gap between books that sell and function in the marketplace, and a lot of books which really, only seem to exist for the purpose of entertaining critics and prize juries.
Afraid that's always been so.
Well, I think it's much more so than it used to be. I think there's a sort of middle ground has disappeared from the English literature culture, and I think that's a sad thing. I mean, I read, that the Booker Prize now has been thrown open to American novels. I read an article in The Guardian by a very good novelist and critic who said that now novelists, he knew, young novelists had come up to him and said, after this, what's the point in going on? Well, this is an extraordinary statement. You're not going to tell me that Dickens or Thackeray or Trollope or any of these people, if a literary prize had been thrown open to the Americans, would have said, what's the point in going on? I thought it was a very interesting, revealing remark about the way the culture is working at the moment.
I think it's time now to ask whether any of you would like to put a question to Robert Harris. We have about a little while. If there are any questions, please. There's somebody over there.
I was very struck that you said that you read Proust for research. I'd be fascinated to know what you read for pleasure.
Well, Proust, obviously. I don't read many novels, to be perfectly honest with you. I do read some, but my main pleasure in reading, the thing I always look forward to are diaries, journals, letters, books that give you unmediated access to the writer's mind or are written without hindsight. I mean, one of the best books I've read for many years, which occupied last summer, was the Diaries of Count Harry Kessler. I don't know how many people here have heard of it, but there's a wonderful new edition come out from Knopf. And Kessler was a German, well-to-do man who moved between Berlin, Paris, and London in the last years of the 19th century and through to 1918. And then there was another volume of his letters, diaries that go up to the Second World War, and they're absolutely brilliant. He meets absolutely everybody. They're shot through of insight. And that gave me an enormous amount of pleasure to read that. I think it told me more about the state of Germany and why the war came about and what a shock it was and how much of civilization was destroyed, reading that book than reading a settled work of history by a historian. So I would always, I mean, you know, the journals of Evelyn Waugh, of Walter Scott, or, you know, the diaries of Jock Colville, or any, that is my particular favourite reading, I have to say.
Any other questions? That one over there?
Can you tell us what happened to Esterhazy after he fled to Harpenden?
Well, that is fate enough. Then he would feel. Esterhazy lived under an assumed name in Harpenden and died in the 1920s. Is buried in the churchyard in Harpenden, I believe. He concocted a story that he admitted that he wrote the bordereau, the disputed document, and claimed that he'd done it under direction from the statistical section, that he was actually always a double agent, that the French intelligence knew what he was doing. This has actually muddied the water for some years afterwards, and there is a school of thought, rather like the Kennedy assassination or whatever, that actually the whole thing really was a set-up, and that Esterhazy handed over chicken feed or misleading information to the Germans to fool them in particular about a gun called the 75, a 75mm gun, which helped stop the German attack in the First World War, and that the documents that he passed to Schwarzkoppen were designed to mislead Schwarzkoppen from the fact that the Germans were developing this particular gun. It's all rubbish, frankly. I mean, but this is typical of Esterhazy. He was just a liar and a chancer all his life. And yes, he died in Harpenden.
Any other questions? Somebody right over there.
I wanted to say I love the book, amazing story. But I wondered if you could step back for a moment and tell us why this was such an important earth-shattering event for the entire world. I'm Jewish, and I understand why it's important to me and to European Jews, but I would love to hear why you think it was so important on a kind of worldwide stage.
I think the first thing it did was show how anti-Semitism could spring up in a sophisticated society. As I say, I think it was because there had been no particular anti-Semitism in French society until the 1880s, and I think it did follow the defeat of a great military power. Could not believe that it had suffered such a reverse. It led to a bout of soul-searching, as I say, and the anti-Semitic caricatures you see in the French press at that time, the fact that Zola's books were burned in the centre of Paris, that he was burned in effigy, that the shops owned by Jewish businesses were smashed, Jewish synagogues set on fire. all this was a precursor, really, of what was to come again after 1918, when again a great military power was defeated and could not understand why, and cast around for scapegoats, and decided it must be because there was something wrong with the purity of their society. So I think that the Dreyfus Affair serves as a sort of terrible warning of the way in which these kind of this prejudice can erupt. We haven't had it in England, and may have been anti-Semitism in England, but not to this murderous extent. And that may be because we've never suffered such a military defeat, which has led to a kind of prolonged soul-searching. So I think that's the lesson of the Dreyfus Affair. Of course, Theodor Herzl was one of those in the crowd of 20,000 who heard the crowd chanting Judas, death to the Jew, when Dreyfus was paraded around with his uniform torn. And at that point he decided that Europe would not be safe for Jewish people, and that this led him to Zionism and to the foundation of the State of Israel. So, the Dreyfus Affair had a kind of seismic effect, in a way, in the world, if you look at it in those terms. When Polanski first asked me to look at this subject, of course he was thinking of it as the man who directed The Pianist, and I worried that the fact that the anti-Semitism of the Dreyfus Affair was almost obliterated by the Holocaust, that it seemed so silly to look at that when you've got this. I mean, but then I saw actually that it was very interesting. It was interesting because of the involvement of the government and the bureaucracy, and the way that quite sophisticated men, and not necessarily immoral or men who weren't decent, were prepared to lie through their teeth to protect what they saw as the greater good of the French army or the French state. And it was interesting to see how that happened, and to see how secret trials almost invariably lead to a miscarriage of justice, because if justice isn't seen and witnessed by everybody and witnessed by the press, it isn't justice. And if you have secret dossiers handed to judges with intelligence evidence, dodgy dossiers, you're quite likely to get something going wrong. And if you have rogue intelligence agencies, making up evidence, who are paranoid about what's happening in society, all these ingredients are present. So when I finished the book, I realized why the Pekar story leapt off the page to me. It's because it's a story that spoke to me very directly. And I think it speaks to us, which is why people have enjoyed the book, I think, because it's France in the 1890s, but it could be us. It could be any sophisticated society where agencies get out of control, and where there's rabid anti-foreigner prejudice whipped up in the press. And that's why it's a timeless story, in my view.
Does anyone else have another question? Over there.
Thanks. I thought that was a particularly interesting answer, Robert, if I may say, because for me, reading the book, the most interesting thing was this whole cover-up, which I didn't understand previously, and you talked about it effectively as though just then maybe it wasn't the cover-up of a corrupt regime, which I rather interpreted it as, trying to cover up a really terrible act. But what I thought you might do, having thought about it as much as you've done, you just heard that answer, was talk about one or two other cover-ups in history. Watergate might be one that jumps to mind, for example. Maybe there are others. Are there lessons that other regimes should learn of that sort?
Well, I think the only thing that when I finished the book, it changed me writing the book in the particular instance that I no longer really am willing to automatically believe what I'm told by ministers or heads. Not that makes me sound very naive for a political journalist before I started, but now I can really see the pressures to lie, and the way Zola says in J'accuse about the French officers, these men go home to their wives and children. And I think it's a great line, because that's what happens. They're not monsters. They convince themselves with a kind of what groupthink, as Orwell would say, that this is the right way to protect the organisation. And it doesn't matter what the organisation is, the French army or the British army with the shootings we've seen, mysterious deaths, or the Roman Catholic Church with paedophilia, or the NHS. You know, whenever you get a large organisation, it will close ranks and people will lie and they will justify it to themselves because they are protecting their comrades, their colleagues, and the organisation. Pekar ended up much more loathed than Dreyfus. It was dangerous to be Pekar. One of the reasons he's such a hero is that, you know, people died during the Dreyfus Affair, and he obviously thought very seriously that he was going to be murdered himself and had to take precautions as a result. So, you know, that I think is the biggest thing that I take from it. I'm sure Richard Nixon and the men around him at Watergate thought they were doing it for America, for their cause, and to protect loyal, decent Americans. That's what they would have thought. The Birmingham Six is another classic illustration. Again, one felt this sort of desire to make men confess, and then the state simply refusing, the judiciary refusing again and again and again to acknowledge the mistake, because they also want to protect themselves. So I do see a recurrent pattern, and seems to me the only antidote to it is scrutiny. Constant democratic scrutiny, which all governments and all organisations detest. But is the only way, I think, to keep an eye on them.
This was a great rift in France, one of the many occasions on which that rift erupted, and it, as you say, it was far more than just a Jew being scapegoated or even the military defending its own. Basically, the division in France was between the radicals, who were Protestants, Freemasons, which in France had a quite different connotation from here, Jews. I know this because Matisse, who came from the north of France, a great industrial stronghold, was in full flight from that, had gone down to the south, had married a girl from the south, and had married into a radical dynasty. And no question in his mind, Dreyfus, well, at any rate, the Dreyfus family, Matthew, from which it was the headquarters of the Dreyfus defence, was in the street where Matisse was living in a garret at the time. So no Frenchman could have been unaware of it, but he was actually a neighbour of what was going on and a witness of what was going on. And when he finally got a studio, it was overlooking the judiciary and the conciergerie, where, you know, the great central French prison. So, but I just take him as an example of Mr. Ordinary from the north, Frenchman, and he was in full flight against all those values, and it would have changed the face of Europe if Dreyfus had never been uncovered, because he stood by that time for so much more than just the little local issues, a whole huge division of the nation, and, you know, the whole process and procedure that has made modern France and modern Europe is crystallized in this case, I think.
Yes, of course it led directly to the disestablishment of the church in France, and it's no accident Pekar was quite a committed atheist, really. He left instructions he wasn't to be buried according to the rites of the Catholic Church, even though he'd been brought up a Catholic. He was a great reader of Spencer, you know, the philosopher of Darwinism, and he was clearly a political radical, a great friend of Clemenceau, and it was a radical cause, yes, one sees that the modern France is struggling to be born in this whole affair, and
to some extent it was one of the places in which modern France was born.
Definitely, and it lingers, and its shadow is still cast today.
I think we have perhaps time for one more question. If person at the very back there.
A question for you both, really, which was, you talked about the importance of getting the first sentence right when you're writing. And I wondered if either of you had ever found a way around that, beginning in an unusual place, whether there are any tricks for that, or whether you really are doomed if you don't get the first sentence perfect.
Do you want to go
Well,
first?
I'll tell you first briefly. Yeah. I completely agree with Robert about that. It's like the first shot of the pistol after which the war has actually begun. And if if it's a dud or you're shooting in the wrong direction, it won't work. As far as I know, the only trick I have for it is you have to catch yourself unawares. Who was it? Very good advice. I can't remember who, but some 19th century journalist said to some starting writer, okay, no, it was an editor of the Times later than that. He said, write your first chapter, then throw it away. And actually that's very good advice, because by chapter 2, if the book's going anywhere, you've got into your stride. You have to catch a stride, don't you think? That is the trick of it. And, well, anyway, as far as I know, that is. Now, we like to know how you do it.
Well, for me, it's always a character, and there's something happens to them, and you're just interested to see how they respond and what happens next. And the moment when I felt that I couldn't do this story as a screenplay was when I just found where Pekar's apartment was, near L'Etoile, still there, 4th floor apartment. He was poor, really, he didn't have much money, and I could just imagine this figure coming out in the 1890s of this apartment, out and walking down across the river to the War Ministry complex. And I just wanted to go with him. I wanted to see what he went, where he went, and what he did. And that is how the book opens. He goes to witness the degradation of Dreyfus and to report on it to the War Minister. And so all my books have that kind of opening of just what's going to happen to this man. And really, one of the things that this book has really taught me, subsequently going on to do the screenplay, is the ineffable superiority of novels to films. Not just for me as a writer, in that I can be the captain of my own ship, however leaky the tugboat, rather than on the ocean liner bridge of some great movie, but because what you write is really only half the battle, that really the other half of what you write is supplied by the reader. That if I describe walking through Paris in a rainstorm, or with the smell of the rain drying on the dusty pavement, or the trees, or the smell, the sewage and the Paris sewers, it's really the reader who fills in the gaps from their own knowledge and imagination, and therefore you meet the reader on a page, and together you create the experience of the book. And that, for me, is vastly superior to simply having it spoon-fed to you on the screen. And why, the accounts of the death of the novel are greatly exaggerated, in my view, because human beings will always have that imagination and crave to meet writers on the page. And that's what I try to do from the first sentence, is to write something that people will go, and it will hook them, and then they will carry on. And that's my pleasure in writing.
I'd like to say thank you very, very much for everything you've told us today. We're hugely looking forward to Cicero, but do you know what secret you will unravel next, or is that even a secret from you?
I've no idea, but that's the great thing. You never know who's going to ring you up and say, would you like to write a thriller about this, that, and the other, and then you find something else completely different.
What about the lady that emptied the waste paper baskets? I mean, I feel she had a story.
Well, it's true. There's a brilliant novel to be written from the point of view of Lucy Dreyfus, Alfred's wife, who was one of the most extraordinary things, actually, who, her husband she had 2 young children, aged about 4 and 2, I think, and their father had been subject to this appalling humiliation. And she kept them out of school, took them out of school, and told them their father was away on an important secret mission. And this inspired E. Nesbit to write The Railway Children. So it's...
First of a trilogy, perhaps.
It is. So, yes, for everybody, there's something in the Dreyfus Affair.
Well, thank you. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful, wonderful. I'm sure everyone here will want to join me have just already thanked Robert and Hilary, but I'd like to add our thanks to you both for an absolutely fascinating insight into the Dreyfus Affair and a writerly life. And I also just had a couple of very quick announcements, if you'll bear with me. Robert will be, I believe, signing his books, in fact, and Hilary too, afterwards. As is always said, if you would bear with us for a moment so that I can escort Robert and Hilary to the book signing area, that would be hugely appreciated after this. Just a couple of very quick things. Firstly, I think sadly it's probably a little late, but if anyone has a silver Ford Fiesta GY03 HHL, you left your lights on, and also if there's a Mr. and Mrs. Richards in the audience, if you could make yourselves known to Carolyn, my colleague, at the end, that would be hugely appreciated. We think we have something of yours, so please make yourselves known. And also, just lastly, for anyone who doesn't know, and those of you who've been here today will know, that the poet laureate Carol Ann Duffy wrote a wonderful poem for us in celebration of Charleston's 25th anniversary, and hand-printed, and copies are available for sale afterwards in aid of Charleston in the entrance marquee, as of course are raffle tickets. So please do join us there. So, but without further ado, please join me in thanking once again Robert Harris and Hilary Spurling. Thank you.